Well, first of all, let me say how honored I am to be here in this seminar of the Contemporary Philosophy of Technology Research Group. Let me say thank you to the organizers, to University of Birmingham for its hospitality, and let me say a special thanks to Elio Di Muccio for the invitation and for all the support. Well, before starting, let me remind you that a very interesting book will be published soon. It is a book edited by Veit Schwab and Johannes Betz, that probably the most of you knows. Material Discourse and Materialist Analysis, Approaches in Discourse Studies. I had the honor of participating to this publication, and I warmly suggest to buy this book as soon as possible. So thank you very much again to Veit and Johannes. Well, probably I will spoil the most of the suspense of this presentation, but I would like to start revealing the answer to the question asked in the title. Could language be technology? Yes, of course. And the other way around? Yes, technology can be language too. Obviously, these immediate answers could present the relation between the two concepts, that is, language and technology, as something obvious and transparent. And actually, we could say that this is exactly the way in which the relation between language and technology appears in front of us in everyday life. Indeed, it seems difficult to imagine a contemporary form of technology which does not involve certain communicative, or if you prefer, linguistic processes. For example, it is easy thinking about the forms of technology which are produced with the specific aim of making the communication possible. From a similar perspective, it is easy thinking about the fact that language and communication are constitutive parts of technology. Hardware cannot work without an efficient software, that is, without an appropriate language. Nevertheless, even if all these connections could appear as something evident, it seems difficult to consider as evident the processes subtended to the relations between language and technology. In this presentation, I will try to analyze these processes in the light of a particular approach. I'm referring to the semiotic theory as developed by the Italian scholar Ferruccio Rossilandi. In line with his thesis, I would like to propose some research hypotheses based on what Rossilandi himself defined as homological method. As some one of you have probably read in the abstract of this presentation, the concept of homology refers to the hypothesis according to which work and language share some genetic structural similarities. Furthermore, according to Rossilandi, these two elements appear as almost inextricable in the social praxis. The fundamental implication of this theory is that every human artifact, from the simplest utensil to the more advanced form of artificial intelligence, can be considered both as linguistic product, that is, as a sign or a message, and as a product of work. Before exposing the structure of this presentation, it seems to me opportune a terminological and categorical clarification. I will adopt the concept of artifact as a synonym of the concept of technical object, and therefore as a synonym of technological instrument. As already said, I will adopt a structural and genetic approach to illustrate how, from the beginning of the hominization process, language and production of artifacts have proceeded in a parallel manner. I believe that this approach can be coherent with the Marxian category of work in general, understood as the process through which mankind has determined its peculiarity, distinguishing itself from the rest of non-human species. I would like to underline that this approach is based on a general and abstract model, and that I'm not interested in finding some historical, in the sense of paleontological or anthropological, confirmation to its validity. This presentation will be divided in 4 parts. First of all, I will analyze the fundamental structure of Rossillandi's model. More specifically, I will analyze what he defines as schema of social reproduction. In so doing, I will illustrate that the conceptual levels implied in this schema, and I will explain why these levels refer to some constructs of the Marxian theoretical framework. In the second part, I will focus on the concept of homology and on the relevance that these theoretical constructs has for Rossilandi's semiotics method. In the third part, I will focus on the several semiotic approaches which have analyzed the concept of artifact, and I will try to explain why the artifact can be understood as a crossroads between work and language. In the fourth and conclusive part, I will focus on a particular hypothesis of Rossilandi's semiotics, that is, the linguistic worker hypothesis. Obviously, at the end of my presentation, I would be grateful for any suggestions, questions, or criticism. Now I will begin by drawing your attention to certain fundamental aspects of Rossilandi's theory, which are, as already said, he defines as materialistic semiotics. But what does materialistic semiotics actually mean? In his ideas for a manifesto of materialistic semiotics, Rossilandi affirms that a materialistic semiotics must be a semiotics founded on social reality, on the actual ways in which humans interact among themselves and with the rest of the living and non-living world. Materialistic semiotics cannot examine science systems apart from the other social processes with which they are functioning all along. Anyway, according to Rossilandi, the best way to describe social reality is to approach it in terms of social reproduction, or gesellschaftliche Reproduktion, as Marx said. Social reproduction is the totality of processes by which any society, from a primitive tribe to a contemporary highly developed society, proceeds in time, preserving itself and at the same time administering some changes in its own internal structure. Describing social reproduction as the totality of social processes, Rossilandi follows certain fundamental assumption of Marx's 1877 Einleitung, that is the introduction to the Grundrisse. As is well known, in this unpublished work, Marx criticized certain methodological incongruences of classical political economy, and in doing so, he delineates certain fundamental insights of his method. For this reason, Einleitung constituted a reference point for several generations of Marxist scholars, especially for those who were interested in detecting and reconstructing the methodological foundations of dialectical materialism. Such an attention characterized also the research work of one of the most important Italian Marxist philosophers of the 20th century, that is Galvano della Volpe. Very briefly, according to Della Volpe, the Marxian method can be distinguished from the method of a classical political economy for a reason. Marx hypothesizes that capitalist process of social reproduction should be considered and analyzed as a structured totality. This means that the social reality should be explained by a schema, an abstract representation of a totality in which all the relations between the parts are clarified and explained. That is logically determined. For this reason, Della Volpe defined the Marxian method as method of the determined abstraction. Defining social reproduction as the totality of processes by which a certain society produces and reproduces itself, Rossilandi refers exactly to the concept of structured totality as theorized by Della Volpe. More specifically, Rossilandi presents the category of social reproduction as a schema, an abstract construction characterized by three analytical levels. The first two levels are methodological devices typical of the Marxian theory. A triad constituted by the production, exchange, and consumption, as Marx schematizes exactly in the Einleitung. Second, the relationship between structure and superstructure, as Marx schematizes in the famous foreword of 1859, that is the preface to his volume A Contribution to Critique of Political Economy. And the third level presents the peculiar characteristic of Rossilandi's model, the level of science systems. According to Rossilandi, Marxist scholars have usually ignored how fundamental the role played by communicative process is in the dialectics between the free economic moments of production, exchange, and consumption. Furthermore, Marxist analysis, as well as their critics, have always considered the relation between structure and superstructure in a purely dualistic terms, overlooking the possibility that such a relation has to be explained through the hypothesis of a mediating element, hence that is to be explained from a triadic point of view. Such a mediating element is constituted by sign systems, which are generated and involved in the general process of social reproduction. Therefore, according to Rossilandi, explaining the role of language and communication, the whole process of social reproduction can be structured and analyzed as a more determined totality. To explain the function of the schema of social reproduction, it would seem appropriate to start from the level of sign system. The theoretical structure of this level is grounded on the assumption according to which it is with the whole of this social organization that man communicates, as Rossilandi said. Such hypothesis implies the methodological assumption that the several types of human communication have to be considered actually as integrated. This means that every distinction between human forms of communication is not to be considered as natural, but rather as a result of certain methodological and theoretical choices. On the contrary, Rossilandi proposed another methodological approach. Adopting certain conceptual instruments typically employed to study nonverbal communication, it could be possible to explain certain aspects of verbal communication and vice versa. Particularly, it could be possible to analyze economic processes as processes of semiosis, and consequently the semiotic character of economics. In the next part of this presentation, I will explain in depth the concept of semiosis and its relation with the concept of work. To sum up, the main hypothesis of Rossilandi is that the economic moment of exchange could be understood as a communicative process, but such a process has to be understood in its turn as a productive moment, namely a moment consisting in the human ability to compose, exchange, and interpret, that is to use, every kind of message. From such a perspective, the methodological role played by the level of production, exchange, and consumption can emerge. Such an analytical device explains how the dialectical relation between production, exchange, and consumption characterize also every social communication. From such a perspective, the general exchange process could be understood fundamentally as a communication process. Namely, every kind of communication can be understood as productions of signs and messages, exchange of messages, consumption of messages and signs. Rossilandi defines the human ability of composing and interpreting messages as linguistic work. With a formula, communication is linguistic work. In the next part of the presentation, I will try to explain why such an assumption represents the theoretical root of what Rossilandi defines as homological method, and I will proceed with certain terminological clarification. Now, I would like just to explain why sign systems can be understood as elements of the material process of social reproduction. According to Rossilandi, any sign systems include as a minimum a code or a canon consisting of the materials that are worked on, the tools of the work, and the rules needed for applying them, and all this being the products of previous work. From such a perspective, it should be stated that the practical communicative use of language presents the same fundamental elements of labor process as defined by Marx. That is, the activity conforming to a goal, the material on which work is applied, work instruments, and products of work. Assuming that sign systems are products of linguistic work, Rossilandi underlines the material and practical character of language and communication. More specifically, the material character of sign systems emerge from the fact that Science systems are systems of artifacts that could not exist in nature without the intervention of man. And if we don't want to admit that something human exists for man without the intervention of man himself, we must hold that the principle that we must hold to the principle that every artifact, however understood, is the result of human work that man has done and can do again. Therefore, language is work. Indeed, just like work, language produces artifacts. Nevertheless, Rossilandi's argumentation implies an inverse perspective. Human language constitutes the fundamental element of economic production. Hence, work is language. Indeed, if agreeing with Marx, we consider human work as an activity conforming to a goal, that is, as a zweckmäßige Tätigkeit, we must also admit that work is inherently semiotic, because that goal is actually a sign, that is, as Rossilandi maintains, a conscious or unconscious, desired or endured mental anticipation of the product, namely a design or a project. Hence, language determines the finalistic character of work. It's taking place according to a program, and a program is nothing else but an organized part of a certain science system, that is, a set of instructions which are more or less implicit in certain forms of human social work. In the light of all these theses, we may reach an understanding of why science systems should be considered as the mediating element in the relationships between structure and superstructure. On the structural level, science systems establish the goals of working processes. Okay, sorry. I said, on the structural level, science systems establish the goals of working processes, playing an active role in the relations of production. From a general point of view, according to Rossilandi, the economic moment of production could be understood as an enormous program which forces the workers to function as its own instruments, materials, and products. Therefore, it should be affirmed that the level of science system organizes the economic base by positing the goals of production. Nevertheless, such a mediation corresponds in its turn to a particular mediation of the superstructural level. In this theoretical passage emerges one of the most original theses of Rossilandi's semiotics. Assuming that every practical activity is organized following the rules of certain science systems, becomes possible to hypothesize that all the science systems are coordinated by a wider program, a general framework controlling certain fundamental processes of social reproduction. Such a gigantic program is ideology. In this regard, the thesis propounded by Rossilandi is that, as a vision of the world, ideology, once it moves beyond a state of mere contemplation, necessarily becomes a purposeful project, a teleological activity which affects the constitution of society as a whole. This is the thesis of ideology as social design, and its main assumption is that every social interaction is inherently ideological, because every human behavior, in some measure, is based on codified and institutionalized part of ideological social design. In the next part of the presentation, I will examine in depth the relation between behavior and program. More specifically, I will try to illustrate how these two categories play a fundamental role in the semiotic analysis of technical objects and their utilization. Now I would just like to draw your attention on a consideration that can be fundamental from a semiotic point of view. Assuming that the construction of every artifact is planned, it implies that every human artifact constitutes the result of an abstractive process in which the human ability of producing and interpreting meaningful sign is necessarily implied. Anyway, I will analyze again this concept in the next part of the presentation. Now I will conclude this part explaining the interaction between the three levels of superstructure, sign system, and structure. Considering ideology as social design, it is possible to state that the ideological factors act at all the three levels, structure, sign system, and superstructure, and that every level influences the other two. For example, observing social reproduction from the level of superstructure, one could see that political and juridical institutions, by means of the codified sign system, for example, like work and private property legislation, organize productive forces in relations of production. Thus, detecting the role of sign system, one could explain more clearly how superstructure retroacts on structure. Then, focusing on the intermediate level, the sign systems are influenced by mode of production insofar as all signs, as outlined above, are artifacts. Thus, the global situation of semiosis could be explained considering that signs are materials, instruments, and products of human work. Ideological institutions establish programs regulating communication, understood as sign production, exchange, consumption. Thus, it could be shown how structure and superstructure influence sign systems. In the end, starting from the structure, it is possible to observe that ideology and communication maintain the mode of production, which means that they are influenced by the programs which organize the productive economic structure. Until this moment, I just exposed the macro level of Rossilandi's theoretical model. I have assumed, for a very abstract point of view, how every kind of society in general, and how capitalist society in particular, reproduces itself. Nevertheless, I have simply mentioned certain fundamental concepts, namely those concepts which concern the topic of this presentation, that is the relation between language and technology. For example, I've just mentioned the concept of homology, the concept of program, and the concept of artifact. Now I would like to focus on the relations between these categories. More specifically, I would like to explain how the relation between language and technology can be hypothesized from a materialistic semiotic point of view. In this regard, I will focus on the fundamental aspects of Rossilandi's method, which he defines as homological method. But what does homological actually mean? Rossilandi borrows this term from biological sciences, where it refers to a fundamental similarity due to community of descent, to a correspondence in structure and in origin between different species. From such a perspective, homological methods consist in constructing a theoretical model through which certain similarities and correspondences between boundaries of analysis which appear as completely disconnected can be identified. Once again, the result of this theoretical construction is a structured totality in which all the parts are reciprocally connected. More specifically, the homological method consists in connecting the two subtotalities of linguistic production and material production in a wider totality, constituted by the human being, understood from a Marxian point of view as a product of its own work. It means that, according to Rossilandi, the Marxian thesis on the anthropogenic character of work should be extended, included the thesis on the anthropogenic character of language, understood in its verbal and non-verbal dimension. Human beings produce themselves through their social work, and in this sense, mankind is the result of the general process of social reproduction. But a relevant part of social reproduction is constituted by the linguistic production. In this regard, it seems to me opportune a terminological and, of course, theoretical clarification. In his 77 monograph, Linguistics and Economics, Rossilandi specifies that the term language, and thus the adjective linguistic also, refer to the verbal sign systems, more specifically to the verbal, oral, and written codes and messages. Of course, he's well aware of the fact that this kind of connotation could be rather conservative. But he underlines also that such a terminological choice depends on the will of distance himself from semiotic theories which assign priority exactly to the verbal sign system. That is, from those theories which assert that non-verbal sign system depends on the verbal one. Hence, distinguishing language from non-verbal sign systems, Rossilandi intends to recognize their reciprocal structural independence and at the same time their reciprocal influence. This does not mean that there was no hierarchy imposed by real needs and sign systems, but it does mean that all basic social sign systems are primary modeling systems, according to the terminology of Lotman, who considers primary only the sign system of language and secondary, instead, all non-verbal sign systems. Let us focus on this latter concept. Rossilandi is referring to the theory of Yuri Lotman, the founder of the Moscow Tartu School of Semiotics. And he is criticizing the fact that this theory considers only the verbal language as a primary modeling system. Now, to explain this argumentation, I would like to refer briefly to the theory of another very important semiotician of the past century, that is Thomas Sebeok. Modifying the notions of primary and secondary modeling system as structured by the Moscow Tartu School, Sebeok develops a modeling system theory based on three levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. According to Sebeok, primary modeling system is the system that allows organisms to simulate something in species-specific ways. According to Sebeok, human animal shares such a device with other species. Indeed, every living being uses its sensorium, that is the totality of its senses, to structure a sign system through which an interpretation of and a life in the external world can be possible. Nevertheless, human species distinguishes itself from the others exactly for its typical and innate capacity of simulative modeling. This typical and innate capacity is language, which fundamental property consists in what Sebeok defines as syntax. That is, the ability of generating an indefinite number of meaningful signs using a limited number of construction pieces. This means that human beings, by means of their primary modeling system, can attribute to the same object a potentially infinite number of meanings. Okay. From such a perspective, the term language does not refer to the verbal sign system, but rather to a mute verbal modeling system which Homo habilis, the first species of the genus Homo, must have had lodged in its brain, but it could not encode it in an articulate linear speech. Indeed, it is necessary to wait until the appearance of the Homo sapiens for this modeling system to be externalized and speech to arise as a secondary modeling system. According to Sebeok, language evolved as an adaptation, whereas speech developed out of language as a derivative acceptation. This means that in the course of the humanization process, language was built by selection for the cognitive function of modeling, and only with the appearance of the Homo sapiens, such a primary system came to be accepted, that is, transformed in its function for communication, first in the form of speech, and later of script, and so forth. Thus, according to Sebeok, becoming a communication-oriented device, language enhances the non-verbal capacity with which human beings were already endowed, allowing them to operate both on the verbal and non-verbal level. In this way, using this enhanced capacity, human animals can structure their tertiary modeling system. And from this highly abstract symbol-based modeling process, human cultural systems finally emerge. From such a perspective, Semiotic can affirm that what Moscow Tartu School calls primary, that is the verbal sign system, is phylogenetically as well as ontogenetically secondary to the non-verbal, and therefore what they call secondary is actually a further tertiary augmentation of the former. In the light of all these theses, it should be clear that when Rossilandi asserts that verbal and non-verbal sign systems are both primary modeling systems, he draws attention to the fact that syntactical capacity is incorporated, as Semiotic would say, in both of them. To explain such a thesis, Rossilandi takes as example a common human utensil, the table knife. Probably, considering this simple example, I can start to clarify one of the research hypotheses that I have mentioned in the abstract of my presentation. I'm referring to the fact that, according to Rossilandi's materialistic semiotics, every technology, from the simplest utensil to the more advanced form of artificial intelligence, can be considered both as a linguistic product, that is, as a sign or a message, and as a product of work. According to Rossilandi, a knife, as well as every utensil, has the level of complexity and utility of a proper sentence. The utensil, in fact, consists in parts which are produced and put together according to certain rules, like the sentence. Now, in what has been called the language of things, in our terminology, a set of non-verbal sign systems, everything that can be done with a knife is equivalent to everything which a knife can be put into a relation, and thus constitutes the discourses, groups of interconnected sentences, of which the knife can be part. The syntactic relation of sentence-knife, suitable for generating finished and meaningful discourse, depend on its semantic value, upon what it tells us. Therefore, emphasizing that an instrument is syntactically structured, just like a sentence, and that the different utensils could be syntactically related according to certain uses, like verbal discourses, Rossilandi maintains that both verbal and non-verbal sign system could be analyzed in the light of the Marxian conception of work. The human capacity to generate, communicate, and interpret articulated sounds can be understood as linguistic work, and it represents a further genetic development of human capacity to generate, communicate, and interpret meaningful signs in general, hence nonverbal signs also. A human capacity which the Italian semiotician defines as sign work. In this regard, Rossilandi suggests that Leroy-Guérin's researchers could confirm the genetic precedence of the sign work in the hominization process. Indeed, the French paleontologist maintains that since the most primitive technical levels, construction of utensil is planned. Namely, all the operations through which an artifact is constructed are executed with a view to its future utilization. Adopting a semiotic terminology, we could say that the processes for which human beings design and produce artifacts coincide with the abstractive process through which human beings interpret their needs. Therefore, production of artifacts should be understood as a fundamental manifestation of our species-specific interpretative work. This latter assumption introduces to the third part of this presentation. Now I will try to explain why it can be possible understanding every artifact as a sign, and why, consequently, it can be possible to consider every artifact as a crossroads between linguistic and material production, or if you prefer, a crossroads between language and work. To do this, I will try to connect different semiotic models. We have seen that production of artifacts can be understood as an interpretative process. Now, to understand the concept of interpretation, we must refer to a fundamental semiotic theory, that is, the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce. In this regard, it seems to me necessary starting with the Peircean definition of sign, underlying the fact that, according to Peirce, every sign is characterized by a triadic structure. According to Peirce, the sign has to be understood as a continuum in which some discrete parts can be identified. These units are the sign, or better, its representamen, that is, its sign vehicle, the object, and the interpretant. Actually, Peirce defines a sign as anything which is so determined by something else, called its object, and so determines an effect upon a person, which effect I call its interpretant, that the latter is thereby mediately determined by the former. According to the Italian semiotician Giampaolo Proni, it can be possible to analyze the objects of use, that is, the artifacts, in the light of this threefold partition. What we could define as the body of the artifact coincides with its representamen. Therefore, the representamen coincides with the material quality of the artifact. The object of the artifact describes how to use the material quality in order to obtain certain general goals. From such a perspective, an artifact can be understood as a sign characterized by a peculiar object. This object is a practical function. This means that an artifact is an artifact if such function can actually be performed. An object of use must function. It must work. It remains to explain what can be understood as the interpretant of the artifact. According to Proni, the interpretant coincides with the response, which the function induces in the user, that is, in the interpreter of the practical function. More specifically, this response coincides with the appropriate behavior towards the artifact. This means that the producer of the artifact, a single person or a specific organization, plans that the user should perform a specific sequence of actions using the artifact. This sequence of action coincides with the behavior considered as appropriate. In this regard, it could be interesting to underline that Rossilandi explicitly connects the concept of use with the concept of behavior, when he affirms that using an object means to behave towards the object. Therefore, interpreting how the artifact should work and how it should be used, the user interprets the specific programs inscribed in the artifact by the producer. The use of the verb to inscribe could appear as completely metaphorical, but it should be clear that the term refers to the syntactical capacity of generating meaningful signs. In this regard, it could be useful to underline that Bruno Latour and Madeleine Krieg adopt an homologous model to describe what they define as assemblies. That is, the relationships between humans and technical objects. In my opinion, it can be possible to understand this semiotic relation as a process of writing and reading. The producer, who the authors call scribe, for example, an engineer, an inventor, a manufacturer, or a designer, inscribes a program in a certain artifact. The artifact prescribes, that is, it allows or forbids certain action to the user. The user can subscribe the program of the artifact, accepting the competencies and performances implied in its use. Or on the contrary, the user can inscribe the program, refusing those competencies and performances. As well, the user can reinscribe new programs in the artifact, redistributing or inventing competencies and performances. The analyst describes the totality of this process. Probably, this process can be further explained adopting a reinterpretation of the Peircean theory. I'm referring to the model of semiosis as structured by Charles Morris. According to Morris, the processes in which something functions as a sign may be called semiosis. To describe such a process, Morris constructs a set of special or technical terms, such as sign vehicle, designatum, denotatum, interpretant, and interpreter. Each of these terms expresses a relational property that a certain thing assumes by participating in the functional process of semiosis. Semiosis is an interpretative process which takes place every time a subject, the interpreter, infers that a certain object, a sign vehicle, is related under a certain aspect, for example, on the basis of a causality relationship, with something else, a designatum. And so, that the first object is a sign of the other object. This particular relationship inheres the semantic dimension of semiosis. The interpreter generates an interpretant when he or she takes account of the relation between sign vehicle and designatum. This further relation inheres the pragmatic dimension of semiosis. Finally, the syntactic dimension coincides with the structure of logical and formal relationships between the different sign vehicles. These three dimensions, that is, the three dimensions of the sign, are contemporaneously involved in every process of semiosis. That is, every time a sign is generated and interpreted. The meaning of the sign, according to Morris, coincides with the system of relations between the three dimensions. Taking account of the connection between sign vehicle and designatum, the interpreter expects that every time a certain sign vehicle appears in front of him or her, that vehicle should designate a class of certain objects or events. If the interpreter detects one member of the class at least, the sign vehicle has its denotatum. As Morris said, to the degree that what is expected is found as expected, the sign is confirmed. In this case, it can be possible to affirm that signs are true insofar as they correctly determine the expectation of their interpreters. An example can clarify this latter assumption. Let us consider the utterance, there is a cat in the kitchen, as a sign vehicle. There is a possibility that a cat could actually be in the kitchen. Such a possibility constitutes the designatum of the utterance. Connecting that utterance, sign vehicle, with that possibility, designatum, the interpreter expects that the cat could be in the kitchen, and this expectation coincides with the interpretant. If the interpreter finds a cat in the kitchen, then his or her expectation will be satisfied, and there will be a denotatum for the possibility designated by the sign vehicle. From such a perspective, the utterance should be considered as true. Therefore, in line with the semiotics of Peirce, Morris supposes that every interpretative process is based on inferences, and consequently, that every sign relation is always subjected to possibility and uncertainty. In my opinion, it could be possible to apply this model to the semiotics of artifact. More specifically, it can be possible to analyze the relation between production and use as a system of inferences. From such a perspective, on the one hand, it can be possible to understand the production of an artifact as based on this inference. If the user will follow the instruction, then the artifact will work, and the program of use will be confirmed. On the other hand, it can be possible to understand the use of an artifact as based on this inference. If I would like to obtain certain goals using the artifact, then I have to follow the instructions. In the light of this consideration, it can be possible to understand the object of the artifact, that is, what the artifact can possibly signify its possible designatum, as a bidirectional process. On one side, the object is the production process, which represents the artifact's past, the chain of causes and effects that produced it as a material entity. On the other side, the object is the possible interaction or use program that is its future. From such a perspective, the production process and the function that is the use program of the artifact should be understood as two discrete moments of the same semiotic continuum. The body of the artifact constitutes the material event which temporarily interrupts this continuum. As Prony said, use and production are two directions of the causal line on which the artifact is placed as material event. The production is the chain of causes and effects that have brought the artifact into existence. The use is the chain of possible and probable causes and effects in which the artifact will be involved. In this chain, the description of two subjects are inscribed: the model user and the implied producer. Prony outlines that these two types of subjectivity starting from two categories of Umberto's eco-semiotics, that is, the enunciative and the enunciator. The model user is the enunciative of the production, that is, the subject who is invoked to interpreting the function inscribed in the artifact by the implied producer, that is, the enunciator of the production. Adopting these ecos categories, Prony intends to illustrate that it can be possible analyzing an artifact as a peculiar form of textuality. Indeed, just like every form of textuality, an artifact presupposes a writer, an enunciator, and a reader, an enunciative. It should be evident that this theoretical model presents certain fundamental convergences with the semiotics of assemblies as structured by Crick and Latour. Nevertheless, I believe that all these theses can be analyzed in the light of Rossilandi's materialistic semiotics. More specifically, referring to the Marxian analysis of the dialectical relation between production and use as structured in the Einleitung, Rossilandi underlines that the artifact constitutes the crossroads in which the two dimensions of work and use or consumption converge. According to Rossilandi, the relation between production and use constitutes a typical dialectical situation of unity distinction. Use is work. At the same time, use is distinguished from work. Starting from this assumption, it can be possible to illustrate one of the research hypotheses proposed at the beginning of this presentation. Why it can be possible to understand the use of an artifact as work? Because, according to Rossilandi, in using an artifact, programmed operations take place. This means that it can be possible to include the concept of use consumption in the Marxian acceptation of work as zweckmäßige Tätigkeit. Work is a goal-oriented activity, and it can be goal-oriented only if it takes place according to a program. Use is in its turn based on specific programs. Therefore, use is work. To explain this dialectical relation, Rossilandi describes the artifact as a process constituted by four elements: the model of production, the tokens of these models, the programs for the use of the tokens, and the execution of these programs. Distinguishing between models, programs, tokens, and execution, according to Rossilandi, we may be able to clarify the relations between productive work and use. From a very general point of view, production regards both the models and the programs, both the tokens and the executions. When we produce a token, we do it according to a model. When we behave in a certain way, we do it according to a program. The model and respectively the program are thus confirmed, reproduced in the token and the execution. To sum up, production of models and programs is production of tokens and execution. Production of tokens and execution is reproduction of models and programs. Obviously, models and programs are in their turn produced by following other models and programs. However, the important aspect of this dialectical relation between production and reproduction consists in the fact that the working process is not concluded with the realization of a certain token. On the contrary, work continues, taking the shape of execution of programs. According to Rossilandi, work is irradiated, distributed, and deposited on all these in unequal ways. At the same time, it is what holds everything together. We have work in the most commonly accepted sense in the production of tokens. It is usually admitted that the production of the relative models is also work. That also the production of programs for use, and especially their execution, is also work, may sound irksome to some ears, according to Rossilandi. Nevertheless, as Rossilandi remarks, there are obvious differences between the model according to which an artifact, a token, is constructed, for example, an electric drill or a movie camera, and the instruction, that is the program of their use, which accompany every token, electric drill or movie camera. The program of use is connected to the model of production, but at the same time, it is generally not reducible to it. On the contrary, it differs from it radically. This appears also in the types of performance required anteriorly and subsequently to the artifact. A good driver can be ignorant about motors, and nobody expects that a surgeon to be expert in the art of tempering steel and manufacturing scalpels from it. Let us say then that we cannot use an artifact without at the same time following a program of use, with the aim of realizing it. In this sense, the work done with an artifact is only an execution, but the execution sends us back necessarily to the production of that very artifact. In the light of this consideration, it should be clear why, according to Rossilandi, use is work. Because, as already said, in using an artifact, programmed operations take place. In this sense, productive work and use are always interwoven to the point of seeming inextricable. And the only method for distinguishing use from work consists in saying that, given a certain artifact, use is subsequent to it, while work is anterior to it. The artifact is here only a milestone for making the distinction. Use is work subsequent to the artifact. But if we leave this distinction aside, what we can analyze is the continuous presence of programs. All these considerations introduce the conclusive part of this presentation. According to Rossilandi, if we want to consider every human individual as a part of a social organization, we should recognize that individual experience takes place in an environment already shaped by society. And that the very behavior of the individual is anchored to something that precedes and guides it, that is its program. Indeed, in line with the exponents of Palo Alto's school, Rossilandi affirms that every behavior or practical action implies the execution of a certain codified program, that is, an organized part of a specific science system. Therefore, every human behavior presupposes certain programs. Nevertheless, this hypothesis does not involve the fact that the execution of those programs should be conscious. Indeed, a human being can be completely unconscious of the operations and the goals which are implied in his work, as well as he or she can be completely unconscious of the several operations and goals which are implied in every process of interpretation, understanding, and communication. This is what Rossilandi defines as the thesis of linguistic alienation. According to this research hypothesis, every human being understood as a speaker or sign producer should be considered as a linguistic worker, that is, as an executor of programs and repeater of obligatory suprapersonal models. As well as an alienated worker, the speaker comes to find himself in the situation of not knowing what he's doing when he speaks, nor knowing why he speaks as he does. The speaker is hired by the society in which he is born. He belongs to the process of linguistic production, which conditions him from the start, which oblige him to see the world in a determined ways, and which make it difficult for him to perform any work which is original or just simply different. Nevertheless, this does not imply that human beings cannot supersede those factors which frustrate their existence, imagining further and alternative social programs. Rossilandi adopts the concept of excess to define this possibility. In my opinion, this latter concept can illustrate how the inextricable relation between work and language is strictly related with the possibility of imagining every possible transformation of the social reality, and every attempt of imagining and proposing new and more human forms of social organization. This new social design should necessarily include new interpretations of the programs inscribed in the most advanced forms of technology, and therefore new interpretation of the languages on which those technologies are based. From such a perspective, a social critique of technology should necessarily coincide with a social critique of its language, that is, with a critique of the social programs determining its production and its use. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions or comments?
So with the Perlocutionary Act, when people talk about security studies and
Security.
yeah, and issues of terrorism and states of emergency,
Okay.
there's some emphasis on the state bringing a situation into existence simply by stating it.
Okay.
So I wondered how that would tie into this sort of relational dialectical model of
Okay.
language
Okay.
artifacts.
Yes. Well, I think that I'm not an expert of speech act theory.
Nor am I.
Okay. But I think that, if I remember well, Austin established the distinction between illocutionary act and perlocutionary act exactly, in the light of what you said. That is, perlocutionary act creates something, creates some real effect in the reality. On the contrary, illocutionary act, it's something purely, we can say, conventional. Okay, an illocutionary act is an act, for example, a declaration of marriage. No, I take you as my wife. Okay, this is a conventional illocutionary act that does not produce effect. That is, it has its meaning and this effect only on the level of the language. But if I take, I don't know, an object, and I don't know what is the term in English, sorry, but I do this against you, this is a perlocutionary act. That is, this gesture has some effect in reality. Okay, I disagree with this distinction because I believe, and in a certain sense, semiotics, and I believe the semiotic of Saussure, of course, the semiotic Rossilandi also, demonstrate exactly that there's not a difference, a real difference between the two levels. Okay, I think that both produce something. There are some articles in the Italian debate about this stuff, written by linguists and philosophers and so on, that try to understand if language is a praxis or is a poiesis. No, referring to the distinction established by Aristotle. So, some say that language is a praxis if it could be understood as an illocutionary act, because there's not production actually. You don't create something new, you just follow an activity that's not produce anything new in this sense. Not act on reality to produce something. In this sense, it's a praxis. On the other side, perlocutionary act produce something, produce some effect outside the language, we can say. Okay, but if we assume that language is work, as Rossilandi said, we have necessarily admit that everything we do in language is work. Because we produce meaning, and we can produce something unexpected. No, in this sense, there's not, I believe, a real difference between perlocution and illocution. And yes, I agree. It's interesting your example. No, in a critical situation. No, if I have understand well, we produce meaning, to control what's happening, to control the event, to explain the event, and so on. But we do in a practical process. So there's not a real distinction. I don't know if it could be a connection with your, not properly an answer to your question, but a connection with what you said. No?
This is a bit out of my depth of this area.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just thinking, I accept the quite attractive idea that language is tied in with practices.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking, just an extreme example, if the government declares a state of emergency, then it's creating, what the artifact, what the relationship would be. The government is just creating a reality by this statement. I suppose you could say it's not creating that reality out of nothing. There's obviously a social embeddedness for people to make sense of that statement. So there, maybe, I guess, dialectical relationship.
I believe that everything that is meaningful is created by language. Okay, so you can say that it does not exist a real emergence, but to realize to this reality as true, you have necessarily to use language. As Morris said, the fact that we can consider an utterance as true depends on the expectation, on the possible meaning of the utterance, and in a certain sense, what we have confirmed, connecting the utterance, the expectation, and the possibility. This is the meaning. Okay, this is the meaning as a process, and you can't escape from this process. If you want to state that an utterance is true, you have to follow that process necessarily, in my opinion. Of course, it's not my opinion, but it's the opinion of Morris. So this is the battlefield. Okay, to affirm that an utterance is false, this is the battlefield in which we are involved. We use language, and we have necessarily to demonstrate with language that the utterance is false, and, for example, that does not exist a real state of emergence, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question? So when you say about the making of artifacts, do you mean from like a making perspective? What about the relationship to gesture and that kind of maybe I'm misunderstanding, maybe gesture is linguistic to you, but like a lot of the time in sort of making, a lot of it kind of transcends kind of linguistic speech. A lot of it's showing, or it's through doing, as opposed to speak, like as opposed to discussing how an artifact's made. Like how would you say that relate? I mean, I might be missing the point of what you're saying, but
No,
how does that relate?
No, sorry, please repeat. Can you repeat again? I don't understand
like the
exactly.
relationship to gesture.
Mm-hmm.
And
Gesture.
Like, so like say when you make something,
Okay.
a lot of it's sort of a physical process, and it's tied together, like the material, and it's tied together by the gesture and the action of
Yes.
production. So how does that relate, like linguistically, or through language? When a lot of the time, I would say making kind of goes.
Yeah.
Like it's a different kind of.
Yes.
Almost.
I think this is what happened. And I mean, everything that human beings do is what is the term in semiotic? Multi-code is the term, something like that. I don't have the term, but I mean everything that we do in a verbal way and in a non-verbal way, necessarily. We can understand the fact that now I'm speaking as an act of producing verbal artifacts. Okay.
So when
But
you say artifact, do you mean more the kind of
I-
words, or do you mean?
Also, yes,
Yeah.
words from this perspective
Yeah,
are linguistic artifacts.
yeah,
Artifacts, the notion of artifacts refers to the fact that it's the human that create language and verbal signs. Okay, because in nature, without human, you cannot have verbal signs. Okay, verbal signs obviously are something specifically human, necessary. In this sense, we can say that they are artifact. Okay, artifact means product of work, product of human activity. Okay, this is the reason why this theory adopts this metaphor, if you want, because it's difficult to imagine that a word can be an object or an utensil. Okay, this is the attempt of Rossilandi of connecting the Marxian theory with the semiotics, with the linguistic studies. Okay, so yes.
So how would that relate to like a gestural act? So would you say that's tied?
Okay, a gestural act, gestural in the sense of body language.
Or even just the
Yeah,
main
Well,
production?
okay, you can imagine, I'm Italian, okay? And, this is a stereotype, of course, but sometimes stereotypes are true. We are famous for using gesture, okay? And in a sense, we as a culture, but this thing could be absolutely real also for the Indian people. We learn a language not only verbally, but also non-verbally. And a demonstration is the fact that I'm communicating with you verbally now, but I can see you that you are answering to me non-verbally, doing this. Okay, so communication is a multimodal. Well, this is the term, communication is a multimodal process. That means that also the gesture is an artifact, because someone had to learn you to use gesture and gestuality. It's part of our culture. It's part of, of our culture as human. I mean, okay. So in the sense, also the non-verbal language is a set of artifacts. It's a sign system made of non-verbal artifacts, signs that are meaningful, signs that are instruments to explain other things. No, in this sense, of course, gesture is an artifact. Always, if you consider that macro level established by Marx, okay, that is that everything that mankind does is the result of its work ability. Okay. Yes.
This kind of follows on from that. I was going to ask a question about that might relate to, and I can see how it's like sort of languages work, I think, because I was thinking about conditions that make it more or less difficult to actually interpret language.
Mm.
So if you've got dyslexia, written language is very difficult to interpret. If you've got autism, body language is very difficult to interpret. And these are, to be like material, these are, like, as we kind of know now, a lot of these conditions are sort of like biological conditions to do with like different ways that the brain develops and so on. It's not just like it's not just a subjective decision to not be able to interpret body language. You know, it's got like a very biological basis to it. So I was going to ask about like, what do you think the relationship is between this kind of like work, so to speak, and sort of things like this, like capacity, you might call it, I suppose.
I mean,
like questions of capacity in being able to interpret different kinds of.
From a biological point
Yes.
of view, you said. I think this particular topic is studied by a branch of semiotics that is called biosemiotics or zoosemiotics, cognitive semiotics, and so on. And yes, they try to find some biological devices that, according to their theory, could allow us to find some universals. Okay, for example, this is a typical human sign that you can find in all the culture, and some of these scholars have found that the baboons communicate or can communicate with this kind of sign that is an index. Okay, so they suppose that in a certain sense something biological exists in the interpretation, and this hardcore of the interpretation derives from our ancestor, our pre-human ancestor. It's not my topic, and I don't know if I don't know what is the state of the research at the moment on this topic. But if a connection exists between a biological element and a further cultural element, well, this connection should be detected in our evolutionary process. Okay, for example, yes, we share this kind of sign system with the apes. So we can imagine that this is a result of the evolution. Okay, but at the same time, as Semiotic said, as Lotman said, we are very different from our ancestors. Okay, there's a connection, but there is also a diversity. And as Marx said, the best way to understand the evolution of the ape is to understand the evolution of the man first. No? So you can understand how how the language of baboons works, because first you understand how the language of humans works. No? So this is what Marx said exactly in the Grundrisse. I don't know if I answered to your question.
I think it's quite an illuminating way to think it through, really, because then you can think about natural limits to capacity. If you think about, like, I suppose sort of a lot of this is kind of like language is a tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So different people, due to these different kinds of conditions and so on, have different capacities in using these tools.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that people have different capacities in using all kinds of tools. I suppose it's one way of making the connection maybe a bit clearer.
Yes. No, I mean, you know that non-human species use tools as well. But the difference between us and them is that potentially we always invent new tools. This is the force of our language, of our sensorium, as Semiotic said, of our syntactical capacity. Some species are so near to us that they invented tools too, but they reproduce always the same type of tool. This is the big difference between us and them.
I was thinking that the argument that languages work has been made more recently by a lot of academics who talk about, for example, reviewing items on Amazon as being work. And then they also talk about communicative capitalism and kind of immaterial labor as being, of course, work, paid or unpaid. So it was but then they say that this is a new form of capitalism, or like, there is something new about this whole thing. Whereas I guess, following your argument, it would be that language has always been work.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering whether you think there is something new about, I don't know, this kind of language being used in this kind of way with the new technologies and digital software.
Yes. Some scholars maintain that Rossilandi is a kind of pioneer in this kind of studies. Indeed, some scholars that are studying the so-called cognitivist capitalism, such as Christian Marrazzi, for example, actually they are studying Rossilandi now. And Rossilandi theorized that language can also work as a capital, because he maintained that language presents some similarities with capital, and so that there is a kind of linguistic ruling class which forces everything, which forces every one of us in communicating, in adopting certain codes, for example. And in this sense, Rossilandi said there is a similarity. Every time we adopt a code in a certain sense, we are working for that code, and we are exploited by that code. And our reproducing of that code is work that we do for that code, contributing to maintaining its power on us. Recently I criticized this position, because I can find a structural similarity between how capital exploits people using their work, and how language control has, in a certain sense, obliging us to reproduce its rules, syntactical rules, grammatical rules, and so on. There are, according to Rossilandi, all these things are, in a certain sense, machines that oblige the linguistic worker to perform his or her work in a certain way. Okay, and according to Rossilandi, this is a form of exploitation. I believe that this form of exploitation is very different from the real exploitation of capital. But on the other side, I believe that the logic of exploitation of capital is perfectly linguistic and semiotic, in the sense that the logic of capital is a code that produces some meanings and attributes some meanings to certain objects. So in this sense, the logic of capital is a language, a perfect language, I mean. This is my, well, of course, this is my opinion, and I think that Marx, if you read Capital, you can find some suggestion in that direction. I mean, you know, the concept that, for example, according to Marx, commodity is a sign, and all the relations which are implied in the production of that commodity are hidden, and are the meaning of that sign as it appears in front of us is it's something absolutely semiotic. One of the most interesting theses proposed by Rossilandi, in my opinion, is to consider Marx as a semiotician, a pioneer of semiotics. No? So, yes, I think that the idea of linguistic capital, linguistic capitalism, it can be interesting, but we have tried to be aware of the difference between how language works in the relations, social relations, and why, on the other side, these social relations are linguistic. Okay, I don't know if I answered. Okay.
Pushing that point further, so you said earlier on that it's possible for humans to ascribe an infinity of meanings to any object, and then we said that there are sign systems that at least inform what the goals of production should be, and mediating this process are tokens. And I think that was a thing about money, because surely I think everything that has a use to us, of whatever kind, verbal, non-verbal, cultural, has an infinity of meanings and uses, and we can negotiate that and renegotiate those infinitely. Yet we still every day experience sign systems that are dominant, and one above all, money, I would say, and that as the explicit goal of production, the production of tokens and the production of more and more tokens, and tokens whose value goes up on its own autonomously. So the goal of production being the production of more money. You said that you described this as ideology, basically, and I'm wondering, is there any space for money in the framework that you have provided as a case or as an example? Because as far as I can see it, retracing what you presented, I think you're offering us a science of signs, particularly a science of money as the chief sign of capitalist society, which we could then actually unmask in quite a systematic way, rather than in a nebulous way, which perhaps confuses, I think, what the uses of money are. Money, yes, I agree,
Yes.
but somehow, no matter how differently we treat it, money, and how differently we treat the things that we get with money,
Mm.
we always end up reproducing it.
Yes.
So I wonder what the role could be of that, and if we thought about extending to that territory.
Mhm. Yes. I think that, again, if we read Capital, in my opinion, it can be possible to underline the fact that Marx, as you said, talks about a lot of meaning of the money. Okay, he detects 4 functions of the money, and in a certain sense, he admits that money have a certain meaning for the people, but on the other hand, it has a meaning in itself. And again, this is what I said, answering to Johanna question. Okay, the meaning of money is determined by the logic of capital, and this is what money is. Okay, money fundamental is the measurer of the value. Okay, and you can measure the value of a commodity if you use money. Okay, this is the meaning that the general logic of capital, the general code of capital, has attributed to this sign in this particular logic. On the other hand, we can say that money has a meaning for every one of us in our everyday life, and means that I can buy all the commodities that are available on the market. But this is a subjective meaning of the money, yes, that differs from the meaning attributed by this autonomous logic, that it not depends on our will. The logic of capital, according to Marx, does not depend on our will. It's an autonomous logic that we originate. This is my theory. We originate this. It's not mine, of course. It's what Marx said, and I try to frame it from a semiotic perspective. We originate the meaning of the logic of capital, the meanings of the logic of capital. But at a certain point, this logic works automatically, without our intention. Okay, in this sense, money has its own specific meaning. Marx discovered the meaning of money, but we use money without knowing what it is, as well as we drive a car maybe without knowing anything about engine. Okay, this is a typical demonstration that we are dealing with a system of signs that act independently from our consciousness. But the interesting fact is that we have created this system of meanings. This is commodity fetishism, in my opinion. This commodity fetishism, in my opinion, is a purely semiotic fact. And Rossilandi had some intuitions about this, but unfortunately, he does not develop these intuitions. But this is, the theoretical point. I mean.
So theoretically, you think that semiotics can be used to study the logic of capital in its totality?
Yes. Yes, and this is what I try to do with my research. Read Marx, to read Marx semiotically. And this is, at the moment, the most, the most of my research is focused on this particular topic, how to read Marx semiotically. It could be interesting, maybe no, I don't know, but this is what I try to do.
To be not historical about it,
What?
to be historical about it, what it made me think about was there's a quote from Marx. I can't remember which title it's in. I can't remember which book it's in, but he says something about that under capitalism the worker is reduced to an abstractivity. It's like a pair of hands and a belly. And I can see definitely how, like, you think about like the 19th century working class that he was writing about. If you were working in a factory in the 19th century, there wouldn't have been a lot of interaction going on. There wouldn't have been a lot of conversation going on because, for one thing, you can't talk over those machines that are just running like that. You know, I mean, like, you wouldn't be able to hear anybody, and in order to talk to each other, you'd have to switch the machines off because it would just be too loud.
I would argue that the language is coded in the machines, so it's you're having a conversation with the tools and the workers. Just to interject.
Oh yeah. I was going to say, it's interesting now to think that how this kind of relationship has changed now in a time where you've got, like, the service sector is a massive part of the economy, you know, like, because I think about, before I came to university, I used to work in, like, coffee shops and things like that, and you're having interactions all the time with people, but these interactions are obviously massively one-sided, unequal interactions. Because you're the worker, you have to stand there, you have to smile and pretend to be nice to them, or depending on where you're working, depends on to what degree you've got to do this. There's a very interesting thing with pret-a-manger, you know, what's it called, pret-a-manger or pret-a-manga or whatever it's called, the like croissant shop. They have this thing called the Pret behaviours, and it came out a few years ago. There's this like list of like 17 behaviours that you have to exhibit if you're a pret-a-manger worker, and you have to be like, this is why if you go into a pret-a-manger you will see people high-fiving each other and hugging each other and all of that, because there was it's actually written into their code of conduct, you know. And there was some quote that the guy who owns it, there was an article written where he was interviewed and he was quoted and he said, "Oh, I can go into the store and predict sales from body language alone. It's like this sort of like emotional work drives up the profits and so on." But it's interesting to think about because it's like it's a completely one-sided relationship. As a worker, you're subordinate. You can't, you know what I mean? You're what you can and cannot do in that interaction is completely restricted along these lines. You couldn't criticise the worker. You couldn't criticise the customer ever because you get disciplined. Like, it's got to be sort of like subordinate and servile. To me, it's like it's a good old master-slave relationship.
I don't know if you've come across, there's a document called the Birmingham Academic and also the Birmingham Professional and the Birmingham Graduate, which basically describes what aspirations and what kind of behaviors academics here should have. And it's very abstract and it's very general and it can be used however one wants, especially.
There was a university in the States that makes academics wear a badge saying, "Have I been of good service?" Coming soon to a Vice Chancellor near you.
And anyway, I believe that these rules of behavior, for example, in in a private work, in work for a company, in a certain sense, according to their perspective, are functional to the to an economic goal. So, in a certain sense, in my opinion, in similar cases, you have the demonstration that different programs interact among themselves. I believe that the main program that, as I said before, is absolutely semiotic, is the logic of valorization. The valorization logic of capital is the main program which lead the economic production, the commodity exchange, and so on. But as Marx said, the commodity producers can just have some intuitions of how their system works. They know just that they have to reach a profit. This is the manifestation of the essence of capital to the commodity producer. So I believe that they try to imagine some programs, they try to create some programs to help the functioning of this logic. I mean, they really believe that if you are polite with a customer, there are more possibilities that you can sell the commodity or the coffee or what else, In a certain sense, they invent some programs to interpret this sign that they cannot understand because they don't know, they can't understand the logic of capital. They can understand, or they try to understand, just the appearance, the shine, said Marx, the semblance of this logic. But this semblance is a sign for them, and they try to interpret this sign, creating new programs, new meanings, and so the program is you have to have an appropriate behavior towards the customer, because I have to sell my commodity. Okay.
On your point about having a conversation with the machine, it's quite an interesting thing to note that now these fast food strikes have happened in America. McDonald's are trying to invest into replacing their customer service workers with machines.
That's kind of inevitability, isn't it? Like the automation. But that's kind of what we've been driving towards since we first got a pick, and it's all about kind of pushing that through. I guess that automation. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing because it takes you away from doing a monotonous, boring job that you're kind of enslaved to. I would is my opinion of that. As someone who makes things, a lot of these tools have been created so you don't have to do those jobs anymore, because a lot of the time they are boring and backbreaking and you don't want to do them. But it's I think it's like you say, the reason, the difference, the biological difference is that we don't regurgitate the same thing. We're constantly, it's a natural, a natural drive to keep developing these things. Whether that's good, but then it's been co-opted by sort of a capitalist commodifiable agenda, which obviously isn't. It's taking people out of their jobs, but maybe it creates other roles in other sectors, I guess. That's what I would say to that. That's my experience of it.
And as Ursula Hughes' argument when she was here, about it's not all doom and gloom, because when technology replaces jobs, other jobs come into being.
Yeah, exactly.
Just on that very quick about the McDonald's. I think there what's interesting is the mechanisation of the customers.
Yeah.
Because then they know exactly, they don't have to read the menu, they can so mechanised, they know exactly what they want. It's not just a mechanising these skills.
Well, now you go to the self-order and you do that job that person was originally paid to do. So it's, like you say,
come back to commodity fetishism, which I think, and this is where I think like this Marxist semiotics is super interesting, because I mean, I don't know anything about linguistics, but I'm trying to figure out whether through commodity fetishism, capital becomes the enunciator, not the, so language becomes a systemic property. It's not about, and this seems to be something genuinely new and interesting. In most linguistics, like we're talking to each other, it's a human act. But what happens when that human act is alienated, becomes a systemic quality, and then we are told what to do by a language that might be non-verbal but is verbalised by us. Is this where is that sort of the direction this will be going in, your sort of research into Marxist semiotics?
Yes, in a certain sense. As already said, I'm studying from a general point of view what are the semiotic elements in capital at the moment. And I worked on recently I worked on an article by Graham and Fairclough. It is Marx as discourse analyst. I disagree with the way in which they interpret the conception of language in Marx. They confuse the two planes, the two levels that you have mentioned.